In this video, I'm going to be talking about the overall evolution of the Earth and things that happen on the Earth, and even before the Earth was there. I'll talk briefly about that. So this is a diagram of the known universe, and the fact that there was a big bang that started everything 3.8 billion years ago, and then we're way out here at the end. So I want to just briefly talk about this overall, and then we'll work our way backwards, actually. So the beginning of life on Earth didn't start at the beginning of the universe. And so initially, after the Big Bang, there was something called a quark soup, and quarks make up the neutrons and protons. And eventually atoms were formed, and then stars were formed, galaxies, and finally the solar system way out here. And again, we're way out here at the end. So here's a little timeline of those events. There's the Big Bang, where everything was pretty much all energy. And then very shortly thereafter, quarks formed, and then protons and neutrons, and then finally about 300,000 years later, atoms began to form, and it was mainly helium and hydrogen. And then the first stars formed about 300 million years after that. About a billion years after the Big Bang, the first galaxies start forming. About 9 billion years in was the beginning of the solar system, and about 9.5 billion years after the Big Bang, we find the first life on Earth. And today is 13.8 billion years after that. At the bottom, if you want to lay this out in terms of feet to see where each of these events occurred, kind of to get an idea of how long ago these occurred. If you get a 25-foot scale, then you can place these events on that scale. But someone once said, life can only be understood backwards, although it must be understood forward. So I want to start with today and then work our way backwards to kind of get an idea of how long ago these events happened. So if we begin with today, on a 4.5 billion year scale, which is about the age of the Earth, then back here were the first dinosaurs and flowering plants. Back a little further, ferns and sharks, insects, reptiles, etc. Back a little further, animals and land plants. And then fungi and green algae about 1.2 billion years ago. Red algae and glaucophytes, the first organisms that contain chloroplasts, were about 1.9 billion years ago. And then eukaryotes with mitochondria around 2.2 to 2.4 billion years ago. Oxygenetic photosynthesis started about 2.7 billion years ago. So before that, the Earth was reducing, the atmosphere was reducing, and then after that, it was full of oxygen, so it was oxidizing. And then around 3.5 billion years ago, the first evidence for bacteria. The first life in ribozymes between about 3.8 and 4.2 billion years ago, and then the formation of the Earth about 4.55 billion years ago, formation of the Moon about 4.3 billion years ago. So currently the Earth looks something like this, with the well-known continents: North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, and Antarctica. But it didn't always look like this, so it changed quite a bit. The oceans were different, the land masses were different, the temperature was different, the amount of CO2, the amount of oxygen, the amount of methane in the air has been very different throughout the history of the Earth. Currently, about 1.7 million species have been identified on Earth, and these are living species on Earth. However, the total estimated number of species that are currently living on Earth is about 12.5 million. So we're only partially through identifying all of them. You can see that a large number are insects, including beetles, butterflies, moths, bees, ants, etc. Other insects also, spiders have a large contingent on Earth, as do fungi, and then land plants also. There's quite a few land plants known on Earth. Because bacteria, archaea, and viruses are more difficult to identify, these numbers probably are much, much lower than they actually are. But this is the relative diversity of species that are known on Earth at this point in time. And of course, one of these species is Homo sapiens, humans, which there's a great deal of diversity in the human population. Also, within the human body, there's a great diversity in the number of tissues and cell types. And so we know that in these multicellular organisms, then you have a differential expression of the genes to form these different cell types, organs, and organ systems. If we move back just a little further, we find fossil evidence that there were many other species of humans and human-related organisms, that is, hominins, as opposed to hominids that also includes the great apes. But there are many different ones, and for a time there were at least 6 or 7 or possibly 8 species that coexisted with humans not too very long ago. And we've also discovered, or scientists have discovered, that Homo sapiens interbred with at least 1 or 2 and possibly 3 other species of Homo, including Homo neanderthalensis, another group called the Denisovians, and possibly Homo erectus. If you go further back in time, then you find other genera that are related to humans by ancestry, and then further back go into bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. But the species Homo sapiens is approximately 200,000 years old, and the split from the chimpanzees was about 5 to 7 million years ago. So again, here's Homo sapiens down here. The hominins are humans and human-like species, and the hominids are hominins plus the great apes. So moving back further, this is looking at the primates. So up here is Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. Here are the chimps and gorillas that split off again around 5 to 7 million years ago. And then some other species of monkeys down here, and then going back even further into placental mammals all the way back to about 50 or 60 or 70 million years ago. So that is a time when they overlapped way back here with dinosaurs as well. Over on the phylogram, up here are the lorises, lemurs, one type of monkey here, other types of monkeys with the apes down here. And here are the hominids, including Homo, the humans down here, kind of embedded in this monkey and chimp and ape branch. And moving back a little further, primates are members of Mammalia. So these are mammals, cats, as well as dogs and elephants and things like that. You also have marsupials, which are a little further back, including kangaroos. Those are also mammals, but they're marsupial mammals rather than placental mammals. So far then, we're about here, where the mammals first appeared around 210 million years ago, which is about the same time dinosaurs first start appearing as well. But the mammals were tiny little shrew-like creatures that you would hardly recognize today. So here's the entire line of mammals, including monotremes, such as the duck-billed platypus, which doesn't have breasts, but it still makes milk, so it's still a mammal. It has mammary glands, but no breasts. And then you get to the marsupials and placentals, which do have breasts now with milk glands. The marsupials being ones where a lot of development happens outside of the uterus, and then placentals where you have a uterus where the embryo and fetus are developing for a much longer period of time. And we would be right there within the hominin section of this phylogram. And realize that within each one of these groups, for instance, this is Felis catus, the cat. It's one species, but it's highly diverse. And so within each one of those little branches I've shown on the previous phylogram, there is variation within each one of those species and groups. And here you see in dogs also a lot of variation within the dogs, again, another mammal, and within each one of the other mammal species and genera, there's a lot of variation in each one of those. And even within each one of those supposed species, and there's a lot of variation in each one of the species, there are hybridization events that can occur as well. So in dogs up over here, they can actually breed with gray wolves, red wolves, coyotes, dingoes, and golden jackals to form progeny that can reproduce. So there's variation in this way as well among not only species, but within species, that is, among the species within a genus sometimes. And of course, we know now this has happened among Homo sapiens that have interbred to form hybrids with Neanderthals and other species. Okay, so let's move a little further back in evolution. So here are the mammals down here, and they have a sister group known as the reptiles. Those have a sister group that split off from them earlier, the amphibians, and then the lobe-finned fish here, the ray-finned fish here, and then hagfish and lampreys, which are known as jawless fish, which evolved some 400 to 500 million years ago. And as I already discussed, from the reptile line, the dinosaurs were part of the reptile group. And one branch of that group developed feathers and became birds. And prior to that, the fish started to develop limbs instead of fins, and those eventually became legs for tetrapods, that is, organisms that had 4 legs and 4 feet. And there's fossil as well as molecular evidence for this. So you can see in the ray-fin fish, you have this bone structure. And then in something called Tiktaalik, which went extinct around 350 million years ago, these are starting with the lobe-finned fish that now have more or less a hand with a fin on the end of it. And then these developed into organisms with feet with many toes, so they crawled on the ground. And then eventually you have organisms that have fully formed legs and feet from those original appendages, which were fins. Some of these innovations were caused by a set of genes called Hox genes. Hox genes turn on sets of other genes in that they don't form the fin and they don't form the hand, but they turn on the genes that form the fins and the hands and the bones and the skin and things like that. So 530 million years ago, there was an ancestral chordate, and then these jawless fish had a certain pattern of those Hox genes. And then you have a jawed fish, including the sharks, and so elephant shark fins look like this. And then the ray-finned fish come out of that, and they have a pattern that looks like this. and then eventually these lobe-finned fish like Tiktaalik, and then organisms that look somewhat like alligators, but they were more or less reptiles that crawled on the land. And eventually you have mammals and birds out here at the end. And you can see the bone structure. The colors match up with each one of those. So you have a sequence of fossil evidence as well as some molecular evidence for all of that. One of the important genes in this process is HOXD13, and it turned on very late in evolution. And what it does is it reduces the number of bones in what will become the hand in us. So that you have, when it's not turned on much, you get a lot of those bones. When it's turned on a little more, you get fewer of those bones, and they're larger. And then eventually it's turned on to a greater extent, and you get fewer of those, like our 5 fingers or 4 fingers and thumb, but they're more substantial than they were in the fish's fin. So now if we move out a little further and we go back further to this branch is approximately 1 billion years ago. Here we are here with the chordates. There are the insects, the arachnids, nematodes, anemones, etc., and then the choanoflagellates here. And so this represents about 1 billion years of evolution. Approximately 540 million years ago, there was something called the Cambrian explosion, and I've already talked about Wolcott, who found a large set of fossils in British Columbia in the shale that contained a large number of animal species that had never been seen before, and it represented a diversity of organisms that hadn't been seen before in animals. So this shows here in this phylogram, and the blue lines show how long in the past these different organisms have been found in fossils. Down here in red, these are the fossil deposits where these organisms have been found, and you can see the split there at about 543 million years ago. So early on, there were very simple organisms, Porifera, the sponges, Cnidaria, things like jellyfish and others, and probably Ctenophora. But then about 543 million years ago, you see an expansion, a great expansion, including echinoderms, chordates, including us much, much later, brachiopods, annelid worms, mollusks, and other organisms. Some have suggested that part of the reason there was an expansion at that time was there was increased predation. So the organisms that survived during that time were the ones with hard shells and things that fossilized easily, so that we have fossils for that. You'll note that for the platyhelminths and the nematodes, there are not many fossils available, and that's because they have all soft body parts, so they don't preserve very well. So the Cambrian explosion probably, this expansion during the Cambrian of animals, probably was slower than previously explained. It probably took several million or so, at least tens of millions of years for this to actually occur. It also occurred not long after, like 100 million years after, a major glaciation of the entire world called Snowball Earth. So that may have had something to do with speciation and this rise in the number and diversity of animal species. So we're only here so far, about 500 to 600 million years ago. So we have quite a ways to go in Earth history. And if you look at the timeline in the universe, we're about here. So very, very close to the end of this continuum, starting from the Big Bang. Here's a phylogram of all the groups of organisms living on Earth, including the animals here and fungi are closely related, connected as what are called the opisthocons. And then amoeba, Archaeplastida or plants, Straminopiles, Alveolata, Rhizaria, Acrobia, Excavata, and then there's the Archaea and bacteria. Now, the light shading here indicates unicellular, the extent of unicellular species in that group. And the dark areas indicate the extent of multicellular organisms in each one of those groups. So you notice that in animals, most of the animal species are multicellular, but there are a few at the base there that are unicellular. And then fungi, mainly multicellular, plants, mainly multicellular. And then you get down to this group of protists, where most of them are unicellular, and then into the archaea and bacteria, where most species are unicellular, but there are a few multicellular species. Much of the fossil data and other types of data indicate that multicellularity began around 1 billion years ago. Although there is some evidence that in the form of fossils actually, that multicellularity may have begun as early as about 2 to 2.1 billion years ago. Here's a phylogram indicating some of the multicellular events. So even in the prokaryotes, that is in bacteria and archaea, there are some stages which are multicellular, where you have more than one cell type growing together. And then up into other groups where multicellularity becomes more and more common. And then up into this group up here, the holozoa, fungi, amoebozoa, where most of the taxa, most of the species are multicellular, but there still are a few that are unicellular. And the multicellular species have increasing numbers of diverse types of cells in the whole body of the organism. And here I put down 2 billion years ago when multicellularity began, because I think the fossils are pretty convincing, although some people disagree and still think that it began around 1 billion years ago. In plants, the progression from unicellular organisms to multicellular organisms and more complex cellular organisms can be studied pretty easily, because many of those species still exist. So you go from Chlamydomonas, which is a unicellular organism, and then Gonium, which aggregates multiple cells inside of a sort of jelly mass to move around and photosynthesize. And then Pandorina, which has a more elaborate structure. And then finally on to these other ones who have more of a ball-like structure with cells inside, cells outside, and then the cells inside start to specialize mainly in photosynthesis, and the outside cells are primarily there not only to photosynthesize, but also to move the entire organism with all the different cells closer to the sunlight where it can photosynthesize. So here's the Archaeplastida, or plant part of that phylogram I showed a few minutes ago. So starting from here are some very simple unicellular organisms, including glaucophytes, rhodophytes or red algae, chlorophytes or green algae, and others. And these can be unicellular, but then eventually some members have become multicellular. And then moving up further into the mosses and bryophytes, and then lycopods and ferns. And then over here are the horsetails and the angiosperms and gymnosperms on this line. And you can see this here shows that in these organisms down here, the gametophyte generation, that is, the generation that produces gametes, male and female cells, or plus and minus cells, is the dominant form. Whereas as you move further out in this direction on this phylogram, then the sporophyte is the major form, and that's the diploid organism rather than the haploid organism. Down here at the base, this is about 1.9 billion years ago, so almost 2 billion years of evolution for plants. The multicellular plants start appearing around 1.2 billion years ago, and possibly earlier, but usually the number is around 1.2 billion years ago. So way out at the tip of that phylogram are the angiosperms, which first appeared around 120 million years ago and have diversified and become very successful. So here are some indications of the diversity in flowering plants. So again, if we want to work in the same direction, going from more recent to further back, the eudicots, things like roses and asters and sunflowers and things like that, first arrived about 120 million years ago. Then you have monocots, also about 120 million years ago, and that includes grasses and lilies, and here's daffodils. And then magnolias and those types of organisms about 150 million years ago. Those are actually primitive angiosperms. Further back are the gymnosperms, the pines and the firs and things like that. 380 million years ago, they made their first appearance. And just before that, 400 million years ago, and ferns dominated for a while, including tree ferns. 400 million years ago, moss is a little earlier, 470 million years ago. Then the green algae, which eventually gave rise to the higher plants, appeared about 1.2 billion years ago, and the red algae about 1.5 to 1.9 billion years ago, including red algae and glycophytes. So now we're back to about the 2 billion year old stage. So here's that same phylogram, and now we're going back from 2 billion to 4.1 billion years ago in that pink region there. So we're really at this very central part of the phylogram where things haven't diversified beyond the unicellular stage. And that includes many protists in the Stramenopiles, Alveolata, Rhizaria, Hacrobia, and Excavata, as well as the archaea and bacteria. So now we have to talk about how did the first cell, or how did the first cells ever assemble? Where did they come from? So out here on the right, we have this divergence of eukaryotic cells with organelles. So you have not only the cell, but you have cells within cells. That is, the Proteobacterium became a mitochondrion, and the Cyanobacterium became the chloroplast, and then we have a nucleus and other organelles as well. Before that, cells without internal organelles were primarily the bacteria and archaea, so they were simpler cells. And then you go back before that, and it appears that the first biological cells did not have DNA and proteins, but they had RNA and peptides, so they were much simpler than the cells we see today. So in terms of multicellularity and eukaryotes, we have the first eukaryote here that has a nucleus, and then we have a mitochondrion entering. Multicellularity is probably just beginning about 2 billion years ago, and then chloroplasts enter a eukaryotic cell, becoming the first plants. And then you go back way back here, and we're getting the first evidence of bacteria and the first organisms that had RNA, ribozymes, and peptides, and these were the first, probably the first living organisms. And here I've shown it starting around 3.8 billion years ago, but some evidence points to an earlier date around 4.1 to 4.2 billion years ago for the first RNA-based organisms. So you can see there's a transition zone here where biological evolution and chemical evolution are crossing over with one another. So some of the chemical evolution, some of the chemicals that were produced prior to the initiation of life already were available to be used by those first organisms. So here I need to introduce the concept of what is life and what isn't life. So it's clear out here we have eukaryotes, which are unicellular and multicellular. They have self-replicating cells with organelles, and multicellular organisms have assembled different types of cells. And then in the archaean bacteria, which have membrane-bound self-replicating organisms, and again surrounded by a membrane. Back in here to Archaeobacterian organelles, which are membrane-bound replicating parasites and endosymbionts, including mitochondria and chloroplasts. And then you get back here to acellular life, including viruses, which are replicating assemblages of molecules. So they're kind of crossing that line to between what is a living organism and what is a non-living organism, or just a base, a self-replicating bunch of molecules. However, as you know, viruses are parasites, so they aren't self-replicating. They require a cell to do their replication. Although organelles require the same thing, and many of the parasites, parasitic archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes also need a host cell. So there's some crossover, some mushiness in trying to separate viruses from cellular organisms. And some viruses have a membrane around them that they gather from the host organism also. And then we go back in here to ribozymes and viroids and prions, which are parasitic molecules that can do certain functions. And finally back here to ribozymes and enzymes that are catalytic molecules. Clearly they're not living things, but they're included in living things. And so these are some of the molecules that predated, especially the ribozymes, predated cellular organisms, but then were used by those cellular organisms, and they're still used. You use ribozymes in your cells every day, so they're absolutely important. One of the biggest ribozymes is the ribosome, which is a catalytic RNA that does translation, translates the mRNA into proteins. So here at the beginning, the organisms were RNA-based and peptide-based back to about 4.1 to 4.2 billion years. And then there was a transition here somewhere where you had the first cellular organisms that, instead of using RNA, started using DNA as their primary inheriting molecule, their molecule of inheritance. And so now you have organisms based on DNA, RNA, and proteins, which is what we have today. Those organisms were successful, so they outcompeted the earlier organisms that were based just on RNA and peptides, although some of those functions still exist in all cellular organisms as well. So we have these multicellular organisms with organelles, and then unicellular organelles, or organisms without organelles, the initial organisms that were RNA-based with polypeptides or peptides. And then how do you get those? Well, many molecules and atoms are able to self-assemble. So you get a lot of self-assembly on early Earth. And then some of those could self-replicate. So not many could, but a few could, especially RNA. And so that was the molecule that was used first. It turned out that DNA, a slight variant of RNA, was more stable, and so eventually that was used as the inheritance molecule, primarily because then you could have larger and larger genomes because there was less mutation. And then the molecules came from smaller building blocks, and so I want to talk a little bit about where those building blocks came from. So here we have biological evolution, where we have DNA-based organisms and then RNA-based organisms. Prior to that, there was chemical evolution. So RNAs were formed, amino acids were formed, peptides were formed, fatty acids, carbohydrates, and many of these can be easily produced under early Earth conditions or coming in on asteroids and comets. So these came from, in some cases, volcanoes, which produced water, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, ammonia, methane, nitrogen, heat, and lightning. In from comets, which deposited a lot of water, amino acids, peptides, and nucleic acids. The sun provided heat, UV radiation for some of those reactions, and lightning, electrical energy. The moon produced the gravitational energy, which was necessary for volcanism, plate tectonics, and the tides in the oceans, which were already present at 4.3 billion years ago. And there were other sources for metals, which acted as catalysts, pressure in the deep ocean, and other elements. In 1953, Miller published a paper, and he was a graduate student, about 24 years old, in Urey's lab in Chicago. And Urey had already gotten the Nobel Prize, so he was famous in chemistry. Miller produced this apparatus where he could introduce things that were probably in the primordial atmosphere of Earth. And then he introduced these electrodes to produce lightning or electrical charges, a condenser to cool those heated gases down, a U joint here, which allowed only a one-way exchange of those products and reactants, and a vessel at the bottom which started out with water to act like the ocean, and then he could pull out the products from time to time from that pool of the primitive ocean. And from this, he found that he could produce a large number of amino acids, including several that are biologically relevant, that is, the amino acids that are in the genetic code for making proteins. And it turned out that he could make at least 10 of the 20 amino acids used in proteins in biological cells. Also, a meteorite that landed in Australia some time ago was analyzed. The interior was analyzed, and it was found that also those same 10 amino acids could be found in that meteorite. Also, they found aliphatic hydrocarbons, fullerenes, carboxylic acids, and other things, including purines and pyrimidines, which are in DNA and RNA, and a couple of other constituents that you might presume would lead to life, or were at least indicators of living things. And so in both of those cases, there are 10 amino acids then that appear to have been produced abiotically, that is, without any biological help, under early Earth conditions or coming in on meteorites. And that's alanine, aspartate, glutamate, glycine, isoleucine, leucine, proline, serine, threonine, and valine. And it turns out that if you look in primitive proteins, that is, proteins that are in all organisms, meaning that they had a very early origin in those organisms and on Earth, there are these 10 are in higher proportions than the other 10 that apparently arrived on Earth or were produced by biological systems later on. So here are a couple of graphs showing that. On the top are the frequencies of the amino acids down there where the arrow is pointing in the most ancient proteins. And those 10, which are assumed to be the most ancient amino acids, are in the highest proportions. And then the ones that are more recent arrivals are in black, so you can see where those appear. On the bottom is a list of the frequencies for all proteins, whether they are ancient proteins or modern. And you can see that those 10 amino acids have shifted position so that most of them have moved down in frequency, and those are indicated in red. And then the other ones that are indicated in green are those that have increased in frequency in the modern proteins. And those are the later arriving amino acids, the ones that are probably produced mainly by biological means. So one of the conclusions from this is that 4.2 or 4.0 billion years ago, life was much simpler because the diversity of molecules that could be used by those living things was also simpler. So very early on Earth, from 4.1, 4.2 billion years ago, there was water. There were at least 10 amino acids available. There were peptides. There were nucleic acid precursors. And there were other building blocks, including those that made fatty acids and carbohydrates. But where did these elements and molecules come from? And the answer is they came from the stars. So the sun and other stars are essentially fusion reactors, so that they take hydrogen and add protons to the hydrogen nuclei to produce helium. So they're primarily hydrogen and helium, and these were two elements that were around very early in the evolution of the universe also. And those fuse together to form more dense molecules or atoms, including beryllium. And beryllium then decays almost immediately into more helium, a different type of helium, as well as more hydrogen atoms. But because of the size of the suns and the stars, there is tremendous pressure inside, forcing more and more of those atoms together. And so you can eventually produce nitrogen and then force more pressure on that to produce fluorine, oxygen, neon, etc. And then in the very core, they get more and more dense. These atoms are more and more dense. So at the middle of those stars, you're left with iron and nickel in the core. And that's usually where it stops. So you stop at iron. So in the early universe and in active stars, things stopped at iron. So you went all the way from hydrogen and helium through the elements, including carbon, which of course is necessary for living organisms, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and those elements are absolutely necessary for biological systems. But then you stop at iron, and so no other elements were formed at that time. So where do those come from? How are those produced? It turns out that the universe is extremely violent. There are many things that happen in the universe that are absolutely produce tons of energy and new elements beyond that. So there are exploding stars, which produce other elements. There are dying stars that also can produce certain elements. And then neutron stars produce other types of elements as well. So if you look at the periodic table of elements now, and things that were present at the origin of the solar system, or most were. Then Big Bang fusion produced primarily hydrogen and helium, not much else. But then you have merging neutron stars, low mass, dying low mass stars, fusion, exploding massive stars, exploding white dwarfs, and you get the other boron, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, a lot of the elements that are absolutely necessary for life on Earth. And specifically, here is the periodic table showing the elements that are used in biological systems, including hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which are the primary elements of organisms. The elements in yellow are the primary ions used in organisms, including sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and chlorine. And then the blue, the ones shaded in blue, are secondary elements, and those include things like iron, manganese, chromium, zinc, that are used in various ways in biological systems. And black are the major toxins: arsenic, selenium, mercury, and lead. Although selenium is actually used in a few proteins as a substitute for sulfur, which is right above there. And so it's not always a toxin. In small amounts, it's absolutely necessary. In large amounts, yes, it's toxic. So because these were formed primarily by stars, the functions of stars and exploding stars, etc., long ago, Carl Sagan said, "We are made of star stuff," which is absolutely true. We could not be here without the sun, the stars, and including exploding stars. So we're finally back here, close to the Big Bang. Covered quite a bit of ground. So what happened at the Big Bang? How did these elements come to be formed? Well, if you look just at a water molecule, it has the nucleus and the electrons going around in each one of the atoms. Then if you look at the nucleus, it's made of protons and neutrons. But protons and neutrons are actually made up of quarks called up-type and down-type quarks. So where did those come from? In the initial few milliseconds after the Big Bang, the quarks started forming, and then as they cooled, they formed atoms. That is, they formed protons and neutrons, forming the atomic nuclei eventually after about 30,000 years. One of the effects of the Big Bang was that it greatly expanded all of the matter and energy that was in that initial singularity and expanded into what is now the universe. So here's another view of the universe being formed from the Big Bang. There's the Big Bang, a giant expansion of the universe, and it's continuing to expand at an ever-increasing rate, actually. And then the formation of quarks, atoms, eventually different elements are formed. Stars and galaxies are formed. The Earth is finally formed here. Life begins shortly thereafter, and we're out here somewhere. Here's a timeline of some of those events. So here's the singularity back here, and then the Big Bang. And then quarks are formed. These fuse into neutrons and protons, eventually forming atomic nuclei. And then out here about 30,000 years ago, atoms are formed with the nuclei and the electrons spinning around them. And then the first stars are formed here, and then some of the other elements up to iron are formed at that point. Galaxies are formed about 1 billion years after the Big Bang. By this time, some of the stars have exploded, some neutron stars have been formed, and more of the heavier elements have been formed and spewed out into space. Right about here, the solar system begins to form, and right about here, the Earth comes into existence, and just a few hundred million years later, life starts to appear in the form of RNA RNA-based organisms with peptides, and then eventually DNA-based organisms with peptides, and we're out here at the end. So there you are, a short history of life on Earth, as well as a bit on where some of those molecules that are used in biological systems came from. Okay, thanks. That's it for this video.